Good morning, namaskar and adab. Welcome to day 2 of the Symposium, Textiles from Bengal, A Shared Legacy. I'm going to just quickly, for those of us who may not have joined us yesterday or the day before, I'm going to do a quick summary of the sessions yesterday so that we're all on the same page. In us beginning with Professor Jain's session as the keynote and closing with Dr. Rosie and Dr. Pavan's presentations on Murshidabad, you may have noticed that these represented two ends of the exhibition itself. And the exhibits in these sections corresponded to those shown in the presentations. So you had objects from the colonial period, Thomas Waddell volumes, the Watson volumes, among others that were shown in Professor Jain's presentations. And we ended by looking at actual examples of datable pieces that we could actually attribute to individuals and families from Murshidabad, and that really closes the exhibition. And that also brings us to a very important curatorial decision that we took in the exhibition. As much as possible, we tried to include wherever, like I said, there was possible objects or exhibits that actually could trace themselves to a particular period or a family. And so provenance was very important, something that Avalon, you spoke about, which is something quite important now in the acquisitions that you're leading in the V&A's collection. Between these two ends of the exhibition and the two sessions on day one, we had the chance to hear about two distinct collecting practices, that of the private Tapi collection in Surat, which represents a very important post-independence period in the country, and how, interests and a passion for collecting is channeled into one of the most important private collections in post-independence India. And it gave us a chance to have a conversation with the more institutional museum collecting practice of the V&A, which of course has seeds in the colonial, in the pre-independence period. Avalon's presentation also brought attention to a few examples of print, which sadly we've not been able to include in the exhibition for various reasons. At one point, Bengal was a very important center for printing, and we know very little about its printing history. We know that Serampur, for instance, did extraordinary silk printing, which was being exported. We know that contemporary designers like Ritu Kumar actually took from a base of the existing hand block printing traditions in Bengal, but sadly not much work has been done on that. So that's something that I'd also like to flag as a gap in the exhibition, of course, which hopefully could be picked up by researchers and scholars as something that needs more attention. When encountering the question of shared legacies, whether in genres such as Katha, Muslin, Jamdani, or even Tangail, we discussed the more formal aspects of how shared cultures are received through the channels of ownership and legalities between countries that in the past belonged to a common geography. Dr. Sethi and Dr. Iqbal led that discussion, and of course, I think we all agree that it provided so much fuel for thought and debate that it's something that I'm taking away as a very, very important kind of thread that needs to be built up in discussion. Is there a possibility for more multilateral conversations between countries in South Asia about these questions is something that hopefully will also be taken up. To share with you, we had considered a session on policy in this exhibition, because I think that on the question of geographical indicators, historians, scholars, academics, archivists have a role to play in working with policymakers in raising questions about provenance, origin, the question of what is history in the context of these objects. So I think hopefully in the future, this is also something that one could take away, that in conversations and gatherings like these, can we have more policymakers in discussion so that we also understand from their perspective on what it means to represent formal government institutional channels, what are the kind of challenges they face, how are these dealt with through more diplomatic channels, and so on and so forth. To highlight some of the points that Professor Jain now picked up, more specifically in making the connections between cotton, opium, indigo, and the slave trade, he made us think about, A, the presence of the French in the subcontinent, which is less known. Ira Mukhoti's path-breaking book recently, The Lily and the Lion, which actually draws attention to the history of Awadh and its connections with Bengal through the French encounter and presence, and the movement of the Nawabs between the two regions, has actually drawn attention to the fact that when in the 19th century, India, partition took place, and East Pakistan, West Pakistan, and India were born. Documents, very important documents in the 18th century were actually consciously burnt by the British. And that eroded a lot of our access to a period where the French were very active in India as well. And it's something that is a huge gap. So if you recall the gown, which is in the exhibition from France, that history of cotton and cotton embroideries for export to France, which of course we know radicalized, completely revolutionized elite were among women in France in fashion. These are histories that are gaps also. These are gaps in histories of Indian textiles and Bengal textiles that could be taken up. The relationship between, he pointed out, the relationship between scientific and botanical research in the colonial period, that of course in our case also provides, for those of us looking at early histories of Indian textiles in the modern period, provides us a very valuable reference. So while these intentions were completely different, the documentation exercises and projects were very different in their intentions, they also provide us the seed for what could be seen as the formal beginning of Indian textile history studies. He spoke about the biases of color and which really takes us to think deeply about conditioning, about taste and taste making, which are very intrinsic even today in the Indian subcontinent, and continue to inform questions of fashion, taste making in contemporary and modern apparel and interior design. The shifts in the directions of trade that he spoke about, the transformation of trade relations, is something that is quite vital and important to the discussions that we're having today. And lastly, he spoke about disruptions in Indian society that led to new encounters, that were created through these new encounters, and the importance of the mass dissemination of visual ideas through new means of popular culture that emerged. So between the two sessions and the two ends of the exhibition, we saw sort of a kind of overview in the presentations of Avalon and Rosemary that also gave you a sense of the different genres of Bengal textiles, which actually now in day two will get more fleshed out. So in day two now we have very focused presentations. We have sessions on embroideries. We have sessions that are going to look very specifically on the Haji Rumal. We have a session on Tagore and Shantiniketan and its relationship with batik, one of which, the idea of which is represented in the exhibition as well in section 1. So we're going to go more focused into each of these genres as much as we can. It's going to give us a chance to see some riveting images, which will be quite fun. And as I shared yesterday at the opening of the symposium, one of the things that we couldn't sadly include in the exhibition for various reasons was the performative aspect of Bengal's textiles, how textiles actually play out in the everyday, in the occasional wear, in performances, in rituals, in pageants, and to sort of find a way to complete our understanding of Bengal's textiles through this aspect. We will conclude today's sessions with one by renowned filmmaker Aparna Sen, who will be taking us through clips of films, of Bengali films, and reflecting on the relationship, design, choreography, scenography, direction of film and the moving image have with questions of textiles, play of light, textures, and of course, cultural contexts. So thank you for this time, and we will now proceed with session 1. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kaul. Just to help you schedule your day maybe slightly better, one more thing, after Aparna Sen's presentation, this evening at 6, we will be showing a documentary film. It's titled Epar Opar, A Shared Legacy, with a runtime of around 30 minutes. Okay, so that brings us to session 1 for the day and session 4 of the symposium. The first session is titled Muslin and Chikankari, Origins, Migrations and Patronage. We will have Dr. Sonia Ashmore presenting muslin in Bengal first, followed by Ms. Paola Manfredi, textile designer and author from Italy and India. She spends her time in both places, presenting on Chikankari. First, if you could have Dr. Sonia Ashmore, please.
Good morning, everybody, and again, my thanks to Darshan and the whole team for putting on this amazing event and inviting me and the wonderful audience who probably know more about some things than I do. I've been asked to talk about India's fine cottons and also a bit more broadly about cotton, so it slightly will be in 2 parts. I will look for the fine cottons produced in many parts of India for both domestic and foreign markets. I will mention the important status of Bengal muslin, both in India and abroad, at the similarities in muslins produced across India, and at the journeys of cotton across the subcontinent. The intervention of the British in the Indian cotton trade effectively resulted in the Khadi movement, which has been revived with urgency today. Thus, I will briefly consider some issues around cotton production and the choices that need to be made by producers, designers, and consumers. Recently, and it may be partly my fault, attention has been focused on the incomparable muslins from Bengal, but deservedly focused, made from a locally grown and until recently almost extinct tree cotton, which is now, people are attempting to revive it. This was a luxurious fabric which clothed the courts of India and beyond, built the city of Dhaka, and contributed substantially to the fortunes of the English East India Company and foundations of the British Empire in India. So, bottom right, this is the tree cotton from which Futikapas, this very particular cotton variety, was made, which enabled the production of this wonderful soft fine cotton. And part of this was due to the spinning, hand spinning of short fibers, and I asked weavers about this, and they agreed that when you spin very short fibers, they're tiny joins, you get tiny joins in the yarn, and because they're so minute, then this gives a particular texture to the fabric. So the variety of cotton was very important, and partly why it was not exactly reproducible in other parts of India where they didn't have the cotton. But there's another story of fine cotton production, most of it actually for markets within the subcontinent, not necessarily for export. The following images show examples of cottons being produced right across the subcontinent. Here is a cotton carder from somewhere in India, not specified where, cleaning the cotton, and cotton spinners and another carder from South India, Tamil Nadu. So I'm just putting these in as indicative images because there's no information to go with them, but I think they tell their story. Here we see, these images show really the community activity that's involving producing a piece of cloth. It's not just one weaver. It's the people who prepare the cotton, who prepare the warps, who finish off the finished fabric. And so here's a sort of 19th century example from South India of preparing the warp threads, possibly starching them as well. And a more recent photograph from a village near Dhaka in Bangladesh, whereas you see, well, actually there were many people involved in stretching these warp threads. So the point I want to make is that it's many hands make one fabric, not just one, as anybody involved in this production doesn't need to be told. So these are just to indicate the fact that pitloom weaving, which was used in Bengal to produce muslin, was done in many areas right across India, from Bihar in the north to Tamil Nadu in the south. So both of these images show the pit underneath the loom, which the weaver can use to work the pedals. And so it seems to be it was common practice to have this style of weaving, although the looms have changed very little, really, over the centuries. Well, there is only written evidence about the fine muslins traded to ancient Rome. Painting and sculpture indicate the use of very transparent fabrics that were surely Bengal muslin, because we know that there was sort of anger about the amount of Roman gold that was sent to India and to Bengal for buying cloth. But as it there's nothing left, but one can't help looking at these statues and this wall painting in Pompeii, for example, which is fanciful, but nonetheless it's representing some fine fabric for which they must have been familiar. The only real records of ancient export fabrics we have are the printed and dyed fabrics from Gujarat, which is another subject, and a world expert is in this room, so I won't say any more about them. Ruth Barnes. Cotton was exported to many parts of the Middle East and possibly Central Asia and Southeast Asia, particularly for the Hajj, which John Gillow will be talking about later, and he'll be talking about these turbans that you see here. Whoops, sorry, back. This turban from the Victoria and Albert Museum that Avalon showed yesterday, and I'll leave it to him to explain more about that. But Bengal muslin and other fine cottons were exported for the white ihram cotton clothing that you wore for the pilgrimage to Mecca. And although there may be written records about this, I haven't actually found them, but there's a nice subject for research. So here we see a surviving, slightly discolored turban of embroidered Bengal muslin. So muslin was worn at the Mughal and both the Mughal and Ottoman courts. So in other words, it was a high status fabric that was expensive, and it was used by people, by elites, not by the common people. So here are just two examples of the Akbarnama being presented to Emperor Akbar. And this book listed, as you probably know, was like an inventory of the contents of the possessions of the Emperor Akbar, including very detailed accounts of his wardrobe and the cloths that he possessed, which were collected from all over India because the courts wandered about. They included muslins which were symbolically worn by the emperor and valued both for their costliness and probably as material indications of the extent of the empire. Now, muslin was actually produced in Turkey, but they seem to have preferred Bengal muslin, perhaps because it was finer, and huge amounts of money, which were complained about again, rather like in ancient Rome, that the Ottoman court, the Ottoman officials were spending too much money, sending money to India to buy muslin for these fine and enormous turbans. So another indication of the export trade that wasn't to Western Europe. So muslins continued to be a fabric worn as a sign of status at India's courts right up until the late 19th century. So here we have Bengal, here, Lucknow, Awadh, which Paola will be talking about more in great detail, a wonderful portrait in the British Library. An official of Tipu's Sultan here, and there's a wonderful painting of the handing over of Tipu Sultan's sons to the British care, in which these boys are both dressed in muslin garments. Lucknow muslin is another story. And here we have the Maharaja, a close-up of the dress of the Maharaja Rao Sindhya of Gwalior. Not quite clear whether it's Jamdani or Chikankari. It's a little bit hard to tell. But in any case, it was the fabric of choice for courts across India. And it was the preferred wear of at least two empresses. Here on the left, Nur Jahan, clearly dressed in transparent muslin, holding a portrait of her husband, Jahangir, Emperor Jahangir, who's also clad in the same twinned outfits, you might say. And on the right, sorry, keep pressing the wrong button, Empress Josephine, wife of the self-styled Emperor Napoleon in France, who was not often represented in muslin because her husband did not agree with wearing foreign fabrics. They had to support French silk, the French silk industry, which had been badly damaged by Bengal imports from India. So here is the style that she preferred, of a sort of Grecian nymph, really, with a classical statue in the background to emphasize this whole kind of classical reference of the style of dress. Although she was expected to wear French silks in public, she had an absolutely vast wardrobe of muslins of her own, and there are wonderful records in the V&A of her wardrobes, and I counted 93 muslin dresses at one point. So she kept buying, and also a lot of cashmere shawls to keep her warm with the dresses on. Muslin was worn by both men and women, clearly, in India, but came to be thought of as a feminine dress fabric in Europe, initially for accessories, here on the left, and eventually creating a whole new fashion style. The aprons worn on the left became extremely de rigueur in fashionable society, but obviously they weren't for doing the washed dishes in. They were elite status objects. It must have been quite expensive, beautifully embroidered, and at this kind of date, definitely imported from Bengal. And you can see here how how muslin moved from being an accessory, then a sort of covering for a dress, as we saw yesterday, and then making the entire garment. Last year, the National Gallery in London displayed this pastel painting by the Swiss artist Jean-Étienne Lyotard. It was the first time it had been shown for some time. The first thing I noticed, of course, was the clothing. Bengal muslin, I thought. But, beautiful portrait. Lyotard was very precise in his depictions of dress, china, and other objects. He'd lived in Asia for some time, and actually in Constantinople, and wore sort of Turkish and Arab dress, and was very observant about the details of dress. So I think we can assume that it's accurate in its depiction. However, it wasn't so simple. On further investigation, the muslin accessories of the young lady in the portrait turned out to be almost identical to samples of striped and embroidered muslin from Gwalior in Madhya Pradesh, seen on the right, as a sample from John Forbes Watson's Textile Manufacturers of India that other people have already talked about. Gwalior is over 1,500 kilometers, nearly 1,000 miles from Dhaka. So this led me to think about other areas producing fine cottons beyond Bengal. Nonetheless, the portrait and the muslin sample in the painting are about 100 years apart. So this raises the question of whether the accessories in the paintings were actually made of muslins imported from Bengal, or even whether weavers and embroiderers from Bengal had migrated to Gwalior when times got hard in Bengal, where there was a royal court there, which may have offered more patronage than British Bengal. Was the muslin imported directly into France or re-exported from Britain? I think there's a whole interesting area to explore here about the migration of skills. Any young researchers here who want a project, I think it's waiting for you. I don't know where the evidence is, but I think there's a lot to be discovered here, actually. So the example on the right here is obviously from John Forbes Watson's famous books that many people have referred to. How have we got back to that? Oh, sorry. So there are at least 120 examples of fine cotton or muslin shown in the first series alone of John Forbes Textiles Manufacturers of India, all currently in production when the volumes were published in 1866. These annotated samples help to identify the date and place of production, and he also often gives the length compared to the weight and what these textiles were used for. So they're extremely useful in trying to evaluate the different qualities of the muslin. Although I do think, as Avalon mentioned yesterday, there's a lot of room for, as it were, some kind of scientific microscopic analysis of these textiles, as you'll see further on, to really try and establish what the differences were and possibly what kind of yarn they were made from and what kind of cotton they originated from. And I think these sort of obsessive British cataloguers of their empire were fairly accurate in describing the textiles on the whole, especially they were collected for international exhibitions mostly, these samples. And so I think that information is fairly reliable, but there's still a lot more information I think that we can extract from them. This is the volumes down, here are the volumes down, some of the volumes down at the bottom, and there's one you can see in the exhibition. Watson's in some ways questionable project, made at the height of British power in India, has nonetheless left us with mostly pristine examples of muslin and other fabrics being made in India at the time. These two examples from the second series of books indicate the superior qualities of Bengali over South Indian muslin as determined by weight compared to length. So he's not talking about thread count, but he's trying to indicate quality in other ways. And they did a lot of measuring in England to try and work out which was the finest Indian or British muslin when they started manufacturing it. And whilst they decided that technically they were the same, the English ones could never compare in a sort of tactile ways with the Bengali muslins. So obviously this apparent superiority of the Bengali muslins was achieved by the skills developed in processing and spinning and weaving the particular cotton variety that was grown around Dhaka, the tree cotton. I'll now briefly show examples of similar fine cottons from different parts of India. They're all from the mid-19th century, as that's the main material evidence that we have left today. These lead us to consider how such similar fabrics came to be made in different places, and whether this was related to the migration of weavers from one area to another, since weaving is to some extent a portable profession. This is likely to have been the case with the chikan embroidery, perhaps migrating from Bengal to Lucknow, where it was developed into a particular art form. So as I said, it's a rich area for future study, I think. So I'll just go through some comparative slides showing you similar fabrics made from different parts of India. I don't know yet how we interpret these. This talk is really more about questions than answers. So here we have a checked muslin from Dhaka, and as you can see, it's one of the many cut pieces in the V&A collections, cut up Mr. Forbes Watson's scissors, but he very carefully labeled, so you can see this, you can't see the number, but this is obviously went into his book number something or other. And here is a checkered muslin from Chandari in Madhya Pradesh at the same period. So here are some examples of fine cotton or muslin with gold ends from different parts of India. Central India, location unknown, Telangana, Hyderabad, and even Rajasthan. I didn't know that Rajasthan made cotton, so whether it was bought there I think is probably more likely, but that was the label that was given. Here are different muslins from Hyderabad from the 1850s. So again, it may have been that the court of Hyderabad was offering more opportunities to weavers, just as even during Akbar's reign, textile artists moved to where the patronage was. We don't know yet. Maybe somebody has the answer here. As you can see, this said it was purchased by the resident in Hyderabad for the Honourable East India Company's London Museum. So these, as Avalon mentioned yesterday, are some of the useful labels that we have, and the exhibition label that tell us very precisely where they were bought and where they were displayed. So here we have some striped muslins which clearly say they're from Madras, and checked muslins from Tamil Nadu. There was more, Rosemary Krill has written a while ago about the preference for geometric designs in South India over representational and even floral ones. And so there we get a lot of striped and checked muslins. Striped and checked muslins from different parts, West Bengal, Andhra Pradesh, and Tamil Nadu. So it goes on and on. How we distinguish all these things is an interesting question. And South India also liked a bit of bling. They liked gold work and budla embroidery on their textiles, so that they must have shone in the sunlight or the lamplight when they were worn. And here, another challenge, Kolkata embroidered muslin on Dhaka-made muslin on the left, possibly for export, the petticoats, from South India on the right. So are these technically different? I'm not sure. Another area to investigate. Did embroiderers migrate south and bring their skills with them? I don't know. Another open question. Lucknow, which Paola will be talking about, and has some beautiful examples here, again, using their own version of Jamdani and muslins. This is to draw attention to the fact that muslin was produced for the Lucknow courts closer to the city, at Faizabad and Mahmudargarh and Shah Jahanpur, which are all in Uttar Pradesh. So whether those weavers migrated from Bengal, I don't know. The civil servant and curator of the Indian Museum, who collected many Indian textiles for the international exhibitions, T.N. Mukherjee, said, Lucknow makes large quantities of plain and striped, bleached and unbleached muslins, which are preferred to European cloths for the purposes of chikan embroidery. They are also used by Indian gentlemen for turbans and summer shirts. So there was a big production and consumption of muslins near Lucknow. So this is beautiful angaka with the royal coat of, award coat of arms woven into the fabric, which is now in the Weaver's Studio collection. So I'll now shift slightly focus to cotton more widely. Cotton has always been a significant commodity in India for thousands of years. By the late 18th century, with the development of industrial spinning and weaving processes, Britain realized the value of India as a producer of raw cotton for its factories and sought both to improve, sought to improve the quality of Indian-grown cotton and to replace Indian cotton goods with British ones made from Indian and American cotton. Nonetheless, there remained a substantial domestic market for cottons of all kinds. And T.N. Mukherjee reported again that plain and striped muslins are made at a place called Man in Uttar Pradesh, which are chiefly exported to Nepal. So there was a sort of slightly all over India market as well. Orcha made fine turban muslins in the late 19th century, he also noted. So the following images, few images, indicate the efforts made to transport cotton for export and around India. So this is a night encampment of a cotton convoy, mostly bullock carts, as far as one can see, proceeding from Rewa, now in Madhya Pradesh, towards the Ganges, presumably then to be shipped possibly to Calcutta. Not clear. It was just a nice image, really. In Bengal, the river systems were crucial to the transportation of cotton and other resources, although it's very complicated to try and track the exact routes since the rivers changed course, the sandbanks moved, as somebody mentioned yesterday, and I found it very difficult to trace sometimes how the muslins arrived from Dhaka to Calcutta by river because the maps keep changing. So the railways were introduced to India to transport commodities such as cotton to the main, in cotton terms, to the main exporting centre of Bombay, whereas Calcutta was the main port of export for muslins and other commodities from Bengal. So here we see some other examples of moving cotton around then and now. Indore, Madhya Pradesh was said to be the cotton district of India in the early 20th century. And here you see these, they were known as coolies, who carried the loads with their British overseer here, telling them to hurry up, no doubt. And interestingly, a more recent image, I don't know where this was taken, but it's women, not men, carrying the loads. You may be interested to note. So here's an image of the cotton yards in Bombay in 1883, and the scale of these yards was matched by the East India docks that were built in London earlier in the century to accept the goods. And these docks, times change, have now been built over for corporate offices and luxury flats and the like. So if you go on the overground railway in that part of London, you can sort of see what's happened. There are practically no docks left. But interesting, the whole scale of it, every image of the scale of this trade is sort of flabbergasting. The success of Indian, mainly Bengal, muslins in Britain resulted in an imitation industry based in Lancashire and Scotland, which were rather sort of damp areas of England, one in the north-west of England and Scotland, obviously further north. Scotland produces the best quality since they had extremely skilled handloom weavers. And the whole imitation industry started out as handloom before it was completely mechanized. So the first part to be mechanized was the spinning, and secondly, the actual weaving. So you end up with imitation muslins, at first produced in hand looms and secondly in large factories. So this is the early muslins were quite coarse, as you can see here, and very often overprinted with very un-Indian looking images of flowers and so on. These are, on the right, images from an archive in Bolton where people made fortunes out of British muslin, and again, much thicker than anything that we've seen from India, if you can think back to those checked and striped samples. On the other hand, in Paisley in Scotland, they produced very fine imitation chikan and sort of jamdani patterns, which were made into dresses like this. That's now in the Glasgow Museum, and these, as I said, these very skilled hand weavers in Paisley that had made silk gauze and so on, and then went on to weave the famous Paisley shawls when muslin went out of fashion. So very adaptable in their skills. As Dreamta Jane mentioned yesterday, there was a huge export trade of which these trade labels indicated the extent to which the Indian markets were targeted by British manufacturers with Indian imagery of all kinds. Next page. The success of British cotton goods directed at the Indian market at the expense of Indian producers were obviously the foundation of Gandhi's Swadeshi movement. Khadi at one stage reduced to a somewhat moribund government enterprise, and I say that because they used to produce very fine cottons, but they introduced mechanical elements apparently. But Khadi has seen a revival, even in the notoriously fickle fashion industry. And here, Khadi makes a big splash at Lakme Fashion Week in Mumbai in 2018. I chose this image because it's got the spinning wheel in the picture. So it's been taken on board, let's say, by the fashion industry, who are now sort of muttering about sustainability and ecology and the handmade again. Today, India is the second largest producer of cotton in the world after China, and the only country where the 4 known species of cotton are cultivated on a commercial scale. Bangladesh produces relatively little, as does Bengal, very little indeed. Bangladesh, although it has a vast garment industry, has to import all its basic raw materials from India and other countries. So this is a general map to show you where cotton is grown in India. So, the cost of cotton. Today we're aware that the environmental and human cost of conventional cotton production to supply the voracious fast fashion industries produces a carbon footprint, waste generation, water consumption, oil usage, chemical pollution, soil and water pollution, deforestation, human exploitation, and health issues, and these are all entwined. You can't separate one from the other. The good news is that India is now the world's largest producer of organic cotton, responsible for around 70% of organic cotton grown worldwide. So let's look on the bright side. It's not always going to be synthetic stuff dumped in the middle of the Chilean desert, as you see below. So genetically modified cotton was introduced into India, partly, one could argue it was a capitalist enterprise, but the intention was also to avoid the common pests such as boll weevils that infected the cotton. And so initially this was to some extent seen as a good thing, although the farmers had to repurchase the seeds every year. But it seems, I'm not entirely clear, but it seems that actually the insects have become resistant, so they're actually returning. And many farmers are either returning to homegrown desi cotton or giving up altogether because it's not been an unqualified success. So 90% at the moment of India's cotton area is from genetically modified cotton seed. And I'm not arguing against technological intervention, but just how we gauge its success and what the price of it is in human terms and even ecological terms, and whether it makes economic sense for farmers to use it, especially if they can grow it organically. Here we are, perhaps a romanticized comparison of the handmade and the machine-made. The implication being, would you rather spend your days in a garment factory churning out so many garments per hour, or sitting with your friends embroidering in a lovely village somewhere in Bengal or Bangladesh? So these are all connected issues. And I don't know if you've read Archana Shah's book called Crafting the Future, but she looks very closely at these issues around India in different successful operations for producing fabrics, which I recommend it if you haven't read it. The garment industry is far more developed in Bangladesh, in that their production supply chain is more concentrated in large factories, whereas apparently in India, it's still very domestic and village-based, and so that the turnaround in places like Bangladesh, as in China, is much faster, so they're more successful at producing millions and millions of garments very fast. So there's a difference there, and whether India wants to compete in this or take a different route is a sort of open question. For example, one textile group in Bangladesh, which has the big world global chain H&M amongst its customers, has around 5,000 machines under one roof, compared to about 300 to 500 in factories in Delhi and Punjab and other parts of India, and much smaller scale production as well. Let's look on the bright side. Khadi. In 2002, the late Matan Singh made a very interesting collection of khadi fabrics made from about 4 states in India: West Bengal, Delhi, Uttar Pradesh, Karnataka, and Andhra Pradesh. And you can see these samples in Bangalore today in the registry of saris. And it's an interesting collection because he describes absolutely who wove them, where they come from, what the thread count is, and so on. And you can see they're held in frames rather like the John Forbes Watson samples in a way. And in 2019, I happened to be in Bangalore by a stroke of luck and saw this wonderful exhibition based on Matan Singh's collection that was curated by the curator of our exhibition here, Mayank Singh Cole, and it was the most beautiful thing with these fabrics sort of blowing in the breeze. So this gave you a real sense of how these fabrics felt and looked and what might be worn, even though they weren't on people. Matan Singh's work encouraged many designers, I think, and to look again at what they were producing here. So here's a registry of saris, sari, and they are doing research and actually producing textiles based on that research on different aspects of Indian textiles. It was also an inspiration to the Japanese designer Issey Miyake, and on the right, an example of his khadi collection, which was done in homage to Maltan Singh. And he also worked with, from Gujarat, the fashion label, which again produced khadi type fabrics. So new generations of clothing designers are consciously using handloom, traditional techniques and natural dyes. So we hope this is a growing movement and that consumers will respond. So here we've got Ashana Shah in Ahmedabad, who's doing this for some time, Santanu Das in Kolkata, China Paruki in Jaipur, Bibi Russell in Dhaka, who is sort of very heavily made wonderful use of gamcha, a very humble material elevated to a fashion fabric. And again, here in Calcutta, Bapadilu Biswas at Bailum, who's produced many wonderful handloom fabrics at affordable prices as well. So also, I'd like to emphasize it's still, despite doom and gloom, it's a living tradition, and with encouragement, weavers can produce the most extraordinary work. So here is master weaver Mr. Sadiq at the Jamdani Festival in 2019 with a piece he wove with a yarn count of 200 times 200, spun on an amber chaka, hand woven with semi-mechanized spun cotton. It took 5 months to weave this piece, which was truly impressive. And a number of weavers were given historical examples to copy. Many of them said they couldn't do it. And when said, well, we'll give you the time, we'll pay for your time, they achieved the most extraordinary results. Another piece took 10 months to weave, which is flabbergasting, really. And on the right, a weaver who I haven't seen, but weaving still in beautiful fine fabrics in Chandari. So the message is, as Darshan Shah has always said, keeping the hands working. Here we've got people threading the reeds in Bangladesh. Again, this is a joint occupation. You have 2 people, one from each side. The Jamdani weavers also usually sit 2 beside each other in the loom, and these very skilled, delicate hands can still make these wonderful fabrics. The challenge is to keep them on the loom, not debase the construction work, or even a computer keyboard, which anyone can do. And I'd like to dedicate this to Darshan Shah, who's also always aimed to keep many hands working and is the dynamo behind this whole project. And here are just a couple of images from her collections. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ashmore, on that fascinating session on what essentially is the fabric of the region. Aram se, please. It is now time to call on stage Ms. Manfredi for her presentation and to also help to supervise this. Yes, okay.
Can you see the screen?
Yeah.
Yes.
Eyebrows and the pointer.
Yes.
Good morning to everyone, and a very big thanks to Darshan for inviting me, and to Mayank, and to the whole team that has made this incredible event possible. Thank you so much. The word chikankari, on the most commonly used chicken, is generally associated with an embroidery tradition from Lucknow in UP. In its classical style, it is a flawless and delicate miniature needlework of imaginary botanical designs, botanical forms, worked in white thread on diaphanous muslin. The predominantly floral designs are interpreted in a variety of stitcheries that create innumerable texture, achieving a look of refined elegance. Chikankari was reputed to be the most artistic and most delicate form of what may be called the purely indigenous needlework of India, as George Watt wrote at the end of, in his Indian Art at Daily in 1903. And I stress on purely indigenous needlework of India, and we'll see later why I stress on that. Sorry. Maybe it is less well known that in the past, chikan embroidery was the name for various styles of embroidery, made in different parts of South Asia, from Kuwait and Peshawar, today in Pakistan, to Chennai, Lucknow, Calcutta, Bhopal, Dhaka, today in Bangladesh. Only a few pieces dated 19th century that have been identified from Lucknow, from Kolkata, from Dhaka, and from Chennai seems to have survived. The embroideries are mainly worked with cotton thread in satin stitch on light muslin, although Chennai, it is known to have also used the silk thread too. They have rather distinctive style, I would say more westernized, the one from Dhaka and Chennai, where white work was done also on net and in chain stitch. George Watt in 1903 suggested that for certain purpose, the Calcutta work is better suited for tea table cloth, where repeated washing is necessary, implying perhaps that the cloth or the embroidery work, or both, would not be as fragile as on other fine muslins. Chikan work from Bengal consisted mainly on goods for trade to the west, while Lucknow Chikankari was significantly different. It was mainly for clothing for wealthy people and for the royal court, at least in the second half of the 19th century, when the situation became much more complex, we'll see later. Which kind of chicken embroidery was characteristic of the other places? It is not really known. Perhaps a common feature was white work on white fabric, or perhaps needlework technicalities like satin stitch or open work. The origin of the word chikan has been traced to the Persian language. It is mentioned in Buranikati dictionary dated 17th century, but it was referred to a kind of embroidery with gold thread. And even later Persian dictionary do not mention an embroidery form similar to the chicken as we know it today. The first appearance of the word chicken in India is on John Richardson, Persian English Dictionary, published in 1806, on which chicken is defined as a kind of cloth worked with the needle in flowers. And maybe it is interesting to note that the entry does did not appear in the first edition of the dictionary, as Sheila Payne mentioned in her book on Chikankari, suggesting that either earlier forms of white-on-white embroidery on sheer muslin from Bengal or from other places were maybe not called chikan work, or that the form that came to be known as chikan embroidery developed at the end of 18th or the beginning of 19th century. We cannot be certain how and when the various forms of chikan in Dhaka, Chennai, or Lucknow mentioned earlier developed, as there are many gaps in existing records, or in any case, in what we had access to. As a matter of fact, the origin of branding chicken or chikankari, the white embroidery on muslin, remains quite unclear. And I would add, it seems that has happened relatively recently, as embroidered muslin seems to have existed since antiquity. According to some authors, chikan is a very ancient tradition dating back to pre-Christian era. Megasthenes, the Greek historian and ambassador to the court of Pataliputra, modern-day Patna in Bihar, in the 3rd century BC, describing the costumes at the court, wrote that they wear flower garments made of the finest muslin. I was quite taken aback when in an Asian art gallery I saw a terracotta plaque from Chandraketugarh in West Bengal, dated pre-Christian era, depicting a richly ornamented woman wearing the finest muslin, dotted with small rosettes, similar to the kind that we find 2 millennia later in Chikankari embroidery from Lucknow in any case. The fine textile from Bengal are mentioned in the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, dated 1st century CE. The cotton muslin were luxurious product exported to the West as early as the Roman Empire, as we have seen during Sonia's presentation, and to Southeast Asia and to the Chinese Empire, as mentioned in ancient document. The apsaras, or temple dancers sculpted on the wall of Angkor Wat in Cambodia, dated first half of 12th century, are dressed in fine diaphanous skirts ornamented with floral pattern. Wine leaf and wave pattern also, almost certainly of Indian origin. Difficult to say if these motifs were woven or embroidered, but in any case, they constitute, as John Guy pointed out, an inventory of design, many of which have remained almost unchanged over the century and across various textile traditions. Allow me a comment regarding this image. The elaborate headdress of the apsara features 5 roundels with a design that is amazingly similar to compound stitches typical of Chikankari from Lucknow, the keel and kangan stitches that are not part of the repertoire of other white-on-white embroideries. Since the 12th, 13th century, Arab merchants were established in the Dhaka region. Among other goods, embroidered textile called kashida were exported from Bengal to Middle Eastern market, as we have already seen from previous presentation. And these were large square cotton and silk scarf embroidered with Munga silk from Assam, with dense motif worked either in running stitch or later in chain stitch. James Taylor, a civil surgeon who surveyed the condition of Bengal population, wrote in 1840, I quote, "Principal embroiderers are Muslim women of lower classes and the wife of Dhobi, who devote their time they can spare from their usual domestic duty in thus earning a little money for themselves and the families. Embroidery appeared to be a favorite occupation among all rank and classes of Muslim women. Formerly, when there was a greater demand for Qasida cloth of different kinds than there is at present, female of the first family in the place were also in the habit of employing their leisure hour in this way. And yet, about 20,000 pieces of Qasidas are annually worked here and are sent to Persia, Egypt, and Turkey, where they are chiefly used as turban. And various references attest to the existence of widespread practice, not only of weaving fine muslin and jamdani, but also of forms of embroidery for commercial purpose in Dhaka since early time. Craftsperson and local trader in Lucknow generally attribute the origin of chikan embroidery to Nur Jahan, the Mughal queen of Persian origin, favorite wife of the Emperor Jahangir. According to this romanticized narrative, she, who was herself an accomplished embroideress, introduced the delicate, flowery Persian aesthetic in embroidery and on the finest muslin. At the time of her first marriage to Sher Afghan, Nur Jahan lived in Bengal for a few years. It is well known that the finest muslin or malmalkas were produced in Dhaka exclusively for the Mughal emperor and the royal household, and they were part of the annual tribute paid by the Bengal province. Sir Thomas Roe was the first English ambassador to the Mughal court from 1615 1618. In his correspondence, he mentioned that the Empress Nur Jahan had a preference for fine embroideries. He asked her that some fine and precious piece should be sent from England to be offered to the Queen to gain her sympathy and access to the Emperor, so as to obtain trading rights for the British East India Company. Mughal are credited to have championed the manufacture of fine textile and embroidery throughout the empire, and Nur Jahan in particular to have introduced new clothing style at the Mughal court. In 1840, James Taylor wrote that under her patronage, the muslin of Dhaka acquired great celebrity, that they became the fashionable dress of the Umrah in the imperial and vice-regal court of Hindustan. To my knowledge, there are no surviving examples of white embroidered muslin dating from the time of Nur Jahan. But on paintings and on portraits, there are often hints of ornamentation which could well be embroidery in white. In a picture, likely painted by the brilliant Bishan Das, dated 1627, but I can't do. So in this picture, Nur Jahan stands holding a portrait of Jahangir. She wears a dress made of the prized diaphanous muslin over stylish striped pants. The edge of the front opening is ornamented with a delicate white scroll. I don't know if you can see it next to, close to her necklaces, and at the edge of the dress she's wearing, there is a very delicate and fine veil, a very delicate white decoration that could well be embroidered, as well as on the portrait of Jahangir. We have a collar, and in the second picture, the border. It's very delicately decorated. Now, from the style of this decoration, we can assume that that they were more embroidered than woven ornamentation. And Mughal painting were also portraying in a rather accurate way all the garments and the beautiful textile that were in fashion, that were part of the pageantry of the Mughal court. So we can assume that there is a certain accuracy in showing not just a decoration not based on actual fact. In a detail of a painting from the Shahjahanama, diaphanous white draperies hang at the arch balcony of the Diwani Khas at Agra Fort. They are embellished with graceful floral white work in the typical Mughal aesthetic of single flowering plants formally arranged against a plain background. Innumerable paintings portrays noblemen and ladies wearing diaphanous dresses, at times enhanced with hint of white work ornamentation on barely perceptible fabric. Woven or embroidered, it's difficult to tell. In this picture, we see Ali Barid Shah, third ruler of the Barid Shahi dynasty at Bidar in the Deccan, from 1540 to 1580. He was reputed to be a great patron of arts, who invited scholars and craftsmen from all over the Indian subcontinent to work in his capital. And I like to show this picture again for the delicate white embroidery. I think it's embroidery, but maybe it's debatable. At the front opening, on the shoulder, and the armhole. Of course, the angarka on the left is much later, but I think that the two styles have a few things in common. Certainly the sheerness of the cloth of the angarka. On the angarka, it is not an embroidered border, but it is more a ribbon. So although at the collar, at the neckline, there is probably needlework or applique work. We cannot be sure. But it is to give you an idea of also these very light and very fine garments could be seen on a body. Now we come to European trading company, which arrived in India in 16th, 17th century. The French East India Company was established in 1664, long after the Portuguese, the Dutch, and the British East India Companies. Textile constitute the bulk of their trade. Different type of document allowed observation of Indian cargoes transported to the port of the Kingdom of France between the 17th to the end of 18th century. And they list hundreds of names of textile. Description on sale notice, traveler accounts, and a few samples of textile found at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, at the Musée des Arts Décoratifs, at the Musée de la Mode in Paris, have often made it possible to identify and even to illustrate several of these fabrics, despite the time gap, but many of them remain rather obscure. The muslins came mainly from Bengal, as they were reputed to be the world's most beautiful one. And the various quality occupied a share of the trade that had been valued close to a third of all the textile imported to France. The archive mentioned muslin embroidered with floral motif or simply embroidered, or embroidered with different design, or with pattern and column. Sometimes they are called Asara in 1738, which, according to a document dated 1747, classify them among embroidered muslin. But it's not very clear what they were looking like. The price of muslin varied greatly, obviously depending on the degree of fineness and the existence or absence of embroidery. Simple muslin could sell for between 35 to 121 livres. Embroidered muslin from 57 to 134 livres. But I'm sorry I can't give you the value in actual money because I couldn't find it. But it gives you an idea of the range. The commercialized embroideries corresponded to the European taste. Instructions relating to the desired pattern were sent to the heads of the trading post in India. The Indian artisans were reputed to be extremely dexterous and meticulous, painstakingly making by hand with a greater perfection and beauty exquisite product, highly coveted in Europe at comparatively competitive prices. Thus, books of model for embroidery and lace most certainly reach the Indian artisan, trigger intense and prolific exchanges at technical and decorative level. On this sale notice of goods from India, dated 1766, we might notice that it lists 2,645 pieces of various embroideries without attendez, broderies diverses et seulement uniquement sorry and 9 pieces of jamdani. The limited number of jamdani available for sale might suggest difficulty in procurement of this fine textile, perhaps due also to the complexity of its production. One of the theories is that jamdani trade employed rough-hookers or darners who repaired the very highly priced muslin and jamdani, both in quantities by the Mughal court as well as by the Nawab of Murshidabad. It is thus likely, it is suggested that likely there must have been, obviously, a large number of rough-hookers working in the muslin industry. And scholars have suggested that the white embroidery on muslin work with running stitch, imitating in a way the texture of jamdani, might have originated and be produced within the rough-hookers community based on rough-hookers craftsmanship in Dhaka. Number of examples in textile history show how weaving and embroidery have often been inspiring and competing with each other. I like to quote a sentence by late Dr. Goswami, which I think it's very nice. I quote, "These dresses have to be seen, worn, and used for one to be able to take in their magic. For then alone do they begin to breathe a life on their own. One has to enter the silent but vibrant world of the painting of the past. It is there that dresses come to life." It's in the introduction to the volume on costume at the Calico Museum. Swatches from the mid-18th century show flower muslin embroidered in running stitch and in whipped running stitch. Embroidered muslin from Bengal were recovered from a Swedish cargo ship that was wrecked in 1739. The fine muslin cape shown here, dated 18th century, is from the collection of Palais Galliera, Musée de la Mode in Paris. It is embellished with alternate stripe of flowering scrolls and single flowers, embroidered with running stitch and whipped running stitch. The similarities of this flower, both in the style as well as in the embroidered work, suggest or could suggest a common origin of this kind of work, and possibly Bengal. The muslin the muslin embroidered with running stitch, his here appliqué on taffeta silk, of this quite spectacular dress, dated also mid-18th century. And the date, it suggests also a Bengali origin. The assumption is based, on one side, on the dating of the dress, on the fact that the way the running stitch is made is not a typical one on any European white work of the time. The style of this running stitch shows similarities with the execution of running stitch on Kasida. This solution of attaching the transparent muslin on a silk fabric, an already precious textile, highlighted the equally precious embroidery that would thus stand out against a color background. In the detail of the inside of the dress shown below, maybe you can probably appreciate more the texture of the embroidery. Madame de Privas de Molière in this portrait by Antoine Raspal, dated around 1780, which is housed in the Musée in Arles in France, is wearing a dress similar to some extent to the previous one. It appears to be also muslin attached on silk. On the side, the lower side of the painting, the bright orange color suggests that is maybe the inside silk that is showing. The dress has a scattered white flower on embroidered on the muslin. And on the side, there is another sample, a detail of a skirt, also in the Musée de Palais Galliera in Paris, where the muslin is attached also to the silk, but it is worked in chain stitch. It is dated slightly later, 1780. Whether the embroidery on chain stitch was coming from Bengal or it was made in France, unfortunately, this old sample don't come with a made-in attach. So there are speculation and that about their origin, but it's a very beautiful embroidered dress, certainly done in a professional workshop and not as a homemade kind of embroidery. Here we have two paintings by Jean-Étienne Lyotard, dated mid-18th century, that Sonia already spoke about the painting showing the family having breakfast. On the right side, again in Palais Galliera, there are sleeve ruffles that are made with the stripe, in that striped muslin, and with flowers embroidered, again in chain stitch. And below, there are. Now, this is one of the sleeve ruffle that I've shown below. I have been hesitating a lot whether to insert these slides in my talk, because although the embroidered work is done with the same running stitch, stray stitch technique, we don't really know whether it was done where it has been embroidered. What struck me was the fact that the flower that is attached, and all the flowers that are attached to the to the scrolls are definitely made in a different kind of cotton, and thread, along, and also the scallop border, and also with different stitch, the flower, suggesting that they might have been added later on to give, maybe from, muslin piece that have been embroidered and then recut according to a pattern, and maybe some flower have been added to it to give a more finished and complete look to the. But I mean, you can argue against it. I share this with you with the reason why I introduced this image, beside the fact that I like it very much, but maybe I'm just imagining. And this is the other sleeve ruffle that from the previous slides. The painting on the side shows Louise d'Épinay wearing a similar kind of. Now, it's difficult to say where does this embroidery come from, although again, the running stitch shows similarities with previous work. It is, but the the interesting things, according to me, here is the kind of embroidery work related to Dresden white work was a form of white work on Indian muslin, and had highly elaborate, pulled work, so much so that it has been compared to lace work. And because of the very fine, so Dresden work was already present in Europe as technique, embroidery technique. The thing is that when muslin arrived in Europe and they started doing this kind of embroidery on muslin, the effect was so completely different that, as I'm saying, it was compared to lace work and even became appropriate for wealthy people to use this kind of muslin embroidery as sleeve or cravat or other apparel element, because it was so fine that could compete with the lace work. Now, the reason why I'm also showing this piece, it's because the combination of pulled work and embroidery in white has sometimes been compared to Chikankari. It became very popular in 18th century Europe, and it was produced in various countries, mainly in Germany and Denmark. Now, again, these are suppositions. Denmark had also established, although briefly and with alternate fortune, an East India Company trading textile from Bengal. So we cannot rule out that embroidered muslin we cannot rule out that embroidered muslin in Dresden embroidery style was introduced in Bengal for the European market. I mean, the production of embroidered muslin. Contemporary advertisement on Dresden embroideries would often specifically mention that they were made on Indian muslin. And the vocabulary of Dresden work, with its typical scroll of flower pattern, pomegranate, tendrils, and group of flowers, echoes Indian and Persian design that we find sometime on chins and palampur. Dresden embroidery main characteristic is pulled work with more than 35 variations of lattice design. This piece has been, it's in the V&A, it has been identified as coming from Dhaka. And it is also interesting maybe to note that James Taylor, in the account of cotton manufacture in Dhaka dated 1851, wrote that Chikankari from Dhaka included a variety of network which is formed by breaking down the texture of the cloth with the needle and converting it into open meshes. According to Taylor, Mohammedan dresses are frequently ornamented in this manner. And he adds that about 30 varieties of this kind of work are produced in Dhaka. So this is quite an extraordinary piece. And we can appreciate so many different variations of this jali work. The fact that he mentioned that there are 30 variations that were produced, it's quite intriguing, and I don't know. I share with you this, and you can maybe argue. In Jali embroidery in in Jali work in chicken embroidery. This is a piece from Lucknow, but it just to compare that in Lucknow Chikankari, we know 6, 7 different ways of doing this lattice work, open work. And here is a nice sample showing some different ways. But to continue on a few pieces from the V&A of white on white embroidery, also identify as chicken. We see 2 different handkerchiefs, which were an accessory, an apparel accessory that was quite, they were all kind of handkerchief from a very elaborate embroidered piece, and I mean, of course, in Europe. These, whether they were produced as souvenir kind of pieces for the European market, showing a different aspect of life in Bengal. They have exotic imagery. This we have seen also already how white on white embroidery on muslin was done for the export market. This is another example of a piece from the Victoria and Albert Museum, which featured the very popular in 19th century Kalka design or paisley, and it's a border, maybe was originally for a shawl, and has been also identified as coming from Dhaka, a very fine white work. Here again, we have already talked about the collection of samples, and here we have 2 close-up of white embroidery from Dhaka, identified as chicken on muslin. Now we come to this piece, because we shift a little bit. We cannot say for sure if this Dopalli top is from Lucknow, although the flawless and miniature embroidery suggests it might be. One of the romanticized narrative about the origin of chicken in Lucknow is about a cap embroidered by a princess for Murshidabad who was married to the Nawab of Awadh. Bored with the life in the Zenana, and sad because the Nawab was not paying any attention to her, she embroidered an exquisite cap that she presented herself to him. The Nawab, mesmerized by the beauty of the cap, made her his favorite, prompting a competition with the other ladies who all took to chicken embroidery. This is one of the various stories told in Lucknow to explain how Lucknow came. I thought it was interesting to mention, and it is an historic fact that the Nawab of Murshidabad and the Nawab of Awadh have at some point joined forces to counter the British without much success. But anyway, this is another story. This piece belonged to the late Mr. Chote Barani, who has been one of my mentors as far as chicken embroidery is concerned. In the late 80s, when I lived in Delhi, I would go to his legendary art and textile gallery looking for antique Chikankari pieces to study them and to gather documentation of the excellence of this tradition to share with the artisan I was working with at Seva Lucknow. Regularly, a ritual would unfold, and after the initial greetings, a magnifying glass would be produced on the table. And then an attendant would bring one mesmerizing piece to be slowly and carefully observed through the glass in all the amazing detail that in all its amazing detail. When many years later I was working on my book, I went to meet him, asking if I could look once again at his Chikankari collection. But he told me that he has given away all of them. And he had only kept one piece, which for him was a chef-d'oeuvre and epitomized all the excellence of the artistry of Chikankari embroidery. And it is this topi. And by chance, I discovered that this topi has been lent to the Houston Museum. Of course, in a way, I'm sorry, it's gone out of India, but maybe it will be beautifully preserved. Now, this embroidery is extraordinary because it's so, I would say, microscopically produced that even with the magnifying glass, sometimes you can't appreciate how many details are worked in various stitches that one really wonders how they've been done. At this point, let me clarify very briefly which chikan embroidery are we talking about. After the exile of the last king of Awadh in 1856, thus marking the end of the luxurious lifestyle of which the court was the center in Lucknow, after the war of 1857, which further contributed to the economic collapse and impoverishment of large section of the population of Lucknow, and the definitive seizure of power by the British, the fortune of the city had to be re-established, also through the promotion of arts and craft in which Lucknow had been rich. Chicken was thus developed at a very commercial level. As this sample, I mean, maybe I took a bit of an extreme extreme kind of, okay. All right, I'll try to. Anyway, so this is what has been later, has been widely promoted. It's mainly shadow work with some jolly work, and that could be done in a more or less accurate way. So this is what actually I'm mainly referring to. And I think that this is also what George what referred to when he termed chicken of Lucknow, a purely indigenous needlework of India. The kind of embroidery, the vocabulary of this embroidery is very distinctive and very different from what was done for more commercial use. The thing is that as I'm saying, Chikankari enduring fame and captivating feelings stem from the flawless workmanship and the exquisite aesthetic that has been attained by the combination of the art of embroidery and the art of muslin dressmaking. And we were fortunate to be able to bring 3 pieces that maybe you can observe more closely to see and what I meant by it. So it was not just embroidery that was extremely fine, but is also how it was merged with the muslin dressmaking technique, and therefore a work between the tailor and the embroiderer. Again, we have here, I'll go very fast, or as fast as I can. An old painting, Shah Jahan, wearing a jama that shows the join in his, especially in the skirt, that are again where the join is invisible, and it is similar to what we have also we found on all the Chikankari piece, these reversible seam that are patterned. And here we have a beautiful, fine muslin where you can see all these seams that are patterned, and you can't, I mean, sometimes they are so perfectly done, you wonder how they could. This is a contemporary piece that we are trying to, I mean, we have been working on organizing workshop with embroiderers and ladies to try to preserve this technique. Another very pleasant surprise was to see at the neckline on this portrait the typical triangular Java edging, which again we find on many old pieces. This is what I meant also when you see the very fine join of a piece, and we have this jacket on the dummy, so you can see it from close, how the very, very thin rolled seam become the support for further embellishment. Here is another example of this incredibly fine work. The low shows that is not embroidered but applique work in a mind-boggling kind of way, although there is also in the upper portion details that are embroidered. Here are different kinds from sample book of a producer showing different style of how a piece could be decorated. And again, this shows how the waving seam has been supporting these little leaves. And the kurta in the exhibition downstairs has a similar kind of work, except that it is done with shadow work and not applique work. And shadow work was considered to be more prestigious, while this work that today we are really unable to reproduce was considered a copy, I mean a cheap copy of shadow work. Here are other images. Now, this just one word about this tepchi work that is done on running stitch. possibly inspired by Jamdani. And I found interesting how this garment that was shown in the exhibition in Tokyo on the on the court costume of India has been lent by Maharaja Bhavani Singh of Murshidabad, dated 19th century, and it is attributed to Murshidabad. I'm not sure of that because it seems very close to the typical chicken embroidery from Lucknow. And here there is the most spectacular, I conclude with this spectacular piece that we have here. And it's been, the first time I saw it, I thought it was an engineer Jamdani of extraordinary quality. And then on closer observation, I saw that the direction, we realized that direction of the ornamentation thread goes in different direction. And this, therefore, most probably, I mean, I think quite certainly embroidered, but embroidered with such an amazing talent, skill, and craftsmanship that it's really fantastic. And I conclude, therefore, with this piece, which is in display, because I think that it's a way to get together again chicken and Jamdani somehow. And voila. Thank you. Sorry for the length.
Thank you, Ms. Manfredi and Dr. Ashmore, for this wonderful insight into the most delicate of fabrics and crafts.